I'm lucky enough to have the best job in our industry, which is the property director at Maggie's. So it's my job to build out the Maggie Centres that a lot of people unfortunately need. So just to pick out just four comments that we've had, just to give a little bit of background. A relaxed atmosphere. These are from all people who have used our various centres, from Fife and Dundee and so on. It's bright, it's light, and the first thing you do is smile. It somehow brings people together. Maggie's is a perfect place to meet people and to see through the emotional turmoil that we've been through. So this is what we're trying to create. So Maggie Keswick-Jenks was our founder some 23 years ago. She was in hospital, having had her third cancer diagnosis, and she was given the news that everybody fears. And the sort of place that the hospital was perfectly good from a clinical point of view. But when she had to face up to the news that she'd been given, she had to discuss the matters of literally life and death with her husband, Charles Jenks. And I've got a picture here, not of the Edinburgh hospital where she was, but a typical hospital, which is at Charing Cross. And so this is the place where you're treated, fine. This is a place where you've also got to discuss things that are very important, emotionally, philosophically. And what Maggie found was that she was having these sorts of discussions in the hospital corridor, which is not the best place. So outside of her hospital window was an old stable block that had been taken over by the gardeners and used as a store at Edinburgh Hospital. And her vision, if you like, was to create a place where people could go to get the emotional support that she knew she needed, and other people around her, her children and her husband. And they, together with obviously her husband Charles Jenks, and her best friend Marsha Blakenham, and Laura Lee, who was her oncology nurse, they put together a sort of a very broad brief and took on a local architect called Richard Murphy, who turned the old stable block into what we now know as a Maggie Centre. It was only ever intended to do the one, but whatever happens in Edinburgh has then got to happen in Glasgow. So when somebody from the oncology department went over to Glasgow, they said we have to have one there. But the original intention, or if you like, the vision from Maggie, was to not lose the joy of living in the fear of dying. And I think that credo has gone through to everything that we do. So what have we created? A warm and welcoming place, a place to find answers to questions, a place to meet people who can share experience, and then the practical, emotional and social support for people with cancer and their families and friends. So that, in summary, is what we arrived at on centre number 1 and what we're doing today at centre number 32, I think we're on. And my background is that I joined Maggie's. I was lucky enough to join Maggie's when we'd got to about centre number 16. And it had quite literally grown from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. There are 60-something big cancer hospitals in the country, and our objective is to build one at each one. So my sort of job, which I hope to do before I retire, is to get it from 16 to 32. And these are the sort of places that we've created. And this is the Gart Naval Centre designed by Rem Koolhaas. And then we've got the centre at Charing Cross. So we just saw a flash of the Charing Cross Hospital. And really the idea, I suppose, to call it that, is that when you have had the sort of bad news given in the clinical facility, you need to distance yourself from that clinical facility, and you almost sort of turn your back and you head towards a very distinctive place of the Maggie Centre. And that walk by sort of turning your back on that facility to walking towards the Maggie Centre is as important as sort of getting to the front door. So opening the door is an acceptance of the cancer diagnosis. So preparing yourself to go through the front door is all important. Anyway, I'm sure a lot of people have seen that background. Just to set out the core principles, though, very few and uncomplicated rules. For instance, the walk from the hospital, from the oncology department to the Maggie Centre is one of those rules. Maggie's original vision about the building to be full of joy is also a core principle. And we're creating a place that is uplifting, that Charles Jenks has described as the architecture of hope. And we're creating a home which is by necessity a sort of informal place, but it has to be organised as well. So we can't just have a sort of a group of well-meaning amateurs who all want to say the right thing. We're an institution that our success is measured. Our donors require to know the benefit of their investment. But for instance, at the Charing Cross Centre, we have a garden when it has its garden implements, such as a wheelbarrow. Now, if we had a wheelbarrow, if I was the estates director of a hospital and I left the wheelbarrow out, I don't think I'd last too long in the job. However, at the Maggie Centre, we do leave the wheelbarrow out, but it's an orange wheelbarrow, and it's always in that same position. And that, if you like, is an indication, a subliminal indication that it's a home. Right, so we'll just move on to the sort of second section. So that was sort of the background. So how do we brief our architects? There is no such thing as a brief. Here you go, architect, design it. It's an iterative process. So we start with an architectural brief, which is a document that any one of you can find on the internet. It's quite generic. It talks about the places needing to be uplifting and light and airy, and we want it to last a long time because we don't want to spend a lot of money on maintenance and so on. And then we get to the detail brief, which we laughingly call the detail brief. It's actually about 2 pages long. And broadly, that sets out the sort of size of the centre that we require, which is based on the cancer population that we serve. And if it was a 500 square metre building, then you'd need 4 toilets. And if it was a 200 square metre building, then you'd need 2 toilets, and so on. So it's a very, very simple sort of set of, just basic room requirements. And then we get to the real brief. And the real brief is, you say to an architect, what we really want is a building that makes people go when they go through the front door. Now, that's a really hard brief. And I've been lucky enough to work on many, several of the country's great projects. And I worked on the Sainsbury Wing at the National Gallery. So the brief there to Robert Venturi was create a place which is the best place to appreciate early Renaissance art. I've worked on Stonehenge. How can we create a visitor centre that gives the best understanding of what people did 12,000 years ago, and so on. So how do you create a building that makes people feel good when they've been given the worst news they can possibly have? Arguably, that must be the most difficult brief of any architect. Now, to get to that point, we have an iterative process. Just to choose, this is a genuine picture at random. So Charles Jenks, Norman Foster, Laura Lee. Laura Lee was Maggie's oncology nurse, who is now our chief executive. And the interaction between the people like Laura, who've got the experience of having, first of all, been the centre head in the first Maggie Centre, and then managed, being chief executive through all of the buildings that we've carried on since she started. And then that brief gets, those discussions get deeper and deeper. This is also at Foster's preparing for the Manchester build. And a quick picture of Frank Gehry after he'd completed the Dundee scheme. And so we realise that we've created something that everyone needs. It's simple, it's human, it's a place to go to talk. We're not overcomplicating it with a great institutional brief. And it's a place of hope where hopes have been dashed. And there's so much interest in what we're doing. We've now got centres in Hong Kong, Tokyo, Barcelona, building one in Stavanger and Oslo and Groningen. And so the charity is not just these days focused entirely in Britain. So now my bit really is how do we deliver that vision? How do we work with architects to create those very special places? In an industry that is averse to risk, we want the design process to be an iterative process. So we recognise that we'll never get to a point where one of the designers finishes and then hands it over to somebody else, and then that person finishes and then hands it over to the builder, and that builder, tenders for it and then hands it over to subcontractors. It doesn't work like that. We recognise that designers have got to work with craftspeople, because we want the architect to have a vision, but that vision needs to be deliverable. So it can't be just, to design some great idea and then over to you, craftsperson, you've got a problem. It has to be a shared journey. And we know that architects, whatever you're building, cannot complete a design, hand it over to a builder, and there's no dialogue whatsoever. So the dialogue is absolutely essential. And this is a typical way, you guys know much more about it than I do, but sitting down with a modern day craftsman to work out the finer points of the wooden structure at Manchester is fundamental to designing something that makes people enjoy the building that they're in. And that's the finished product. Now, so moving on to my own thoughts about it. So why is the industry so fractured? And I think one of the things, and I have to confess to having been a stereotypical consultant project manager in the past, I'm very worried about it. I worked on the Tate Modern project with Herzog and de Meuron, and they're very proud architects, as I'm sure you would all know, and they hated the idea of a project manager being involved, and they saw me as a sort of impediment between them and the director, Nick Sirota. I didn't feel that I would be, but it was a difficult position to be in. And after about a year of working in a fairly antagonistic way, it was time to get the consultant to sign up to the appointment document. So we had to face up, me and the project architect, to putting our differences right. And we had a long conversation over the phone, and I said, look, we've got to go back to first principles here. Tate have told you what the budget is. They've told me the same budget. They want a building that's designed by Herzog and de Meuron. Therefore, I want a building designed by Herzog and de Meuron. So there's no differences between what you want and what I want. And I think the architect then went away quite happy, thinking, oh yeah, I'm glad we had that conversation with Chris. I went away thinking, why am I not part of the Herzog and de Meuron team directly? What's my organisation? Why is it an independent company that is managing this project? And I'm not diminishing the role of project managers. Project managing as part of the architectural solution is vital, but it shouldn't be outside of the umbrella of the architectural objective. And then we get the crazy logistics of the conventional tendering process. So I worked on a project, Tate House Gallery in Chichester with Sandy Wilson and his team. Lovely project, and I was overjoyed to see that we'd got drawings, some of them 1-to-1 details, 1-to-5 details. The pile of drawings was enormous, and so much, it could be built without asking any questions, theoretically. So you wrap it all up, you put it into a tender document, and then you get 5 tenderers to over 5 weeks to theoretically give you a proper price. The logistics of that is absolutely ridiculous because you've got to get all of those drawings, pull out all the joinery drawings, send it to the photocopier. They photocopy it 5 or 6 times. They send it to then the joiners. The joiners got to then pick it apart and say, well, that bit of hardwood joinery is done by that supplier and that. And then the main contractor takes all the drawings back from the photocopying shop, puts them back into the pile, pulls out all the drawings to do with plastering. Same thing again, and it ain't going to happen. So the only way that you're going to get a sensible price from a tendering process is by a main contractor with his estimator putting his finger in the air. And if we're doing something that's never been done before, as we are at Maggie's, that's a rather impossible situation. And then I started to look at the sort of more traditional arrangements, and I started to think of a rather ludicrous example. So supposing Laura Lee said, Chris, rather than getting a building done, let's get a work of art done for to be done for next October, and we want Vincent Van Gogh to do it for us. So I said, great. So I'll go and see Vincent and say, yeah, right, Vincent, let's work back. So you've got to have it done by next October. How long does it take the paint to dry? Well, that's probably about a month, Chris. Okay, so work back from that. How long does it take you to put the paint on the picture? Well, that's probably about 6 months' work. Okay, let's work back from that. So how long does it take you to stretch the canvas? And he says, well, that's probably about, that takes so long. So I said, right, Vincent, so that means that next Thursday afternoon, you've got to tell me what flowers you're going to paint. So next Thursday afternoon comes by, and I say, right, Vincent, what's it to be? And he said, I haven't had the inspiration yet, Chris. I don't know. I don't know. But Vincent, if we're going to be late, we're going to miss the October deadline if you don't tell me. I'm sorry. No, Vincent, we went through it. You said, and he said, oh, no. Okay, then we'll do pansies. So he goes away, paints it, and we have the big unveil, and the pansies are shown, and Laura says, it's a bit of a shitty picture, isn't it? And Vincent says, well, yeah, I'd have done sunflowers if Chris had given me a bit more time. My silly illustration there shows that in order to have a creative building, you need a little bit of time. So to wind up with my last slide, the briefing process is iterative and it's also cumulative. When the Foster's team came back from their research into several other Maggie Centres, they came back and said, now we get it. And this is after they'd seen several centres, after they'd read the architectural brief, after they'd read the detailed brief, after they'd spoken to me, after they'd spoken to Laura, and they came back and said, now we get it. It's like walking into your best friend's mother's kitchen. And then the supply in inverted commas of a Maggie Centre cannot have more than one owner. So and by that I mean that you can't have somebody like me saying, I'll take responsibility for it, because we're driven by the need to balance the design with the art of the possible, with the budget that we've got and so on. And I can't take those sorts of decisions. Only the creator can take those sorts of decisions. And creator with a small c, I hasten to it. And then we've got what I've called the flaw in the cost, time and quality triangle. So going to project managers school, if there was such a thing, we're told about this famous triangle of cost, time and quality. And what you've got to do is to work out where the ball is within this triangle. Is it nearer the cost, or is it nearer the time, or is it nearer the quality? That's all very good in theory, but if we are delegating authority to take decisions, then project managers are very good at being able to talk to architects and getting them to design it so it can be built quicker, or getting it to design it to be built cheaper. But they can't tell an architect to design it better, because a project manager doesn't know what better is. And it's also very easy to measure cost and time, but it's very hard to measure quality. And I did hear the other day that the capital cost of one of these sort of £1 billion hospitals is outweighed every 4 years by the cost of running the hospital. So in a way, the cost and time is pretty much irrelevant when looking at the overall life of the hospital. And then tendering has got to be done by specialists and not by generalists. So we want to go to people who work on our the aspiring metal work or timber, to people who've done it and know how to price it sensibly and realistically. And then I came to the final slide, which is the deal. So we've got all the people in the area of the local hospital, several thousand new cancer diagnoses who need a Maggie Centre. That gets funneled down into our towards the charity as a whole, and then it gets funneled down through Laura Lee to me, and I'm the sort of interface between the supply side. So that supply side is egg timer likes with lots of builders and craftspeople at doing it, working on site, coming through the consultant team to the creative brain of the architects, say Norman Foster, and that responsibility to deliver an uplifting building for a budget that has been set by necessity is a deal between the architect and the patron, i.e. Maggie's. And I think really to just finish up, I don't really want to say that we're trying to do something that was done 200 years ago, but it really is the recreation of the architect as a master builder. Anyway, thank you very much.